Great teacher. My name is Megan Copeland. I run Buckingham International School of Education. I'll do a very quick introduction before handing over to our speakers today, Professor Barnaby Lenon and Tracy Smith of the University of Buckingham. They will speak for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. First, a little bit about us. The University of Buckingham offers a range of flexible online education degrees and initial teacher training courses designed for educators around the globe. And Buckingham International School of Education are the sole international partner of the Faculty of Education at the University of Buckingham in China and now also in Hong Kong. And we support the university to promote their world-class distance learning programs in China and Hong Kong. And we also offer admission support to those applying for the courses, which means we have an admissions team based in China, which is on your time zone. The team is there to answer your questions, support you with your application, review your application, and help submit it to the university at no additional cost to yourselves. So that's a little bit about us and a bit about the university. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Professor Barnaby Lenon has taught in and led some of the best schools in the UK, including Eton, Highgate, and Harrow. He helped establish the London Academy of Excellence in East London, one of the most successful state sixth form academies in the UK. And now Professor Lenon is Dean of Education at the University of Buckingham, where he spent his time perfecting the art of teacher training. Tracy Smith focuses on primary education and has taught at and been head teacher at a number of primary schools across the UK before becoming head of primary teacher training at the University of Buckingham. Tracy now works both with schools and at the University of Buckingham. And Professor Lenon and Tracy Smith have recently co-authored a book called Introduction to Teaching, which presents a lot of the research you will hear about today. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we finally start. We will mute everybody's microphones to minimize disruption. So if you have a question to ask the speakers, please type it in the chat box and we will take questions from there. Our guest Tracy has to leave the webinar a little before 8 p.m. today. So when we take questions, we will prioritize questions for Tracy. However, Professor Lenon will be able to remain with us. And so we will keep we can keep the Q&A going for a while after that. And I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you for that warm welcome and good evening, everybody. So we'll kick right off, I think. So Barnaby, would you like to start by telling us how do we know who a good teacher is?
Okay, everybody, nice to speak to you. So I think it's tempting for me and Tracy to just reel off a list of the characteristics of good teachers. But before we get to that point, I don't think it's always obvious what a good teacher is. And so I'm going to make just a few introductory comments in that respect. So I think, first of all, the fact that Tracy and I are both on this call, I'm representing secondary schools, that is schools for children aged 11 to 18, and Tracy is representing primary schools, that there's a difference between a good primary school teacher and a good secondary school teacher. I'm sure we all recognise that. There's also in England a difference between a teacher who's really good in a selective school, academically selective school, and a teacher in a school which has the full range of ability, or a teacher who's teaching maybe in an area of disadvantage with a high proportion of the pupils having special needs, and a teacher who's teaching in an area of advantage. I also think, and this is absolutely obvious, it seems to me, there's a big difference between a teacher of art and a teacher of physics. So a lot depends on the subject that you're talking about. And also, I would say that when I'm looking at my staff, because I was a headmaster for many years, I might start by looking at their exam results. But there are always some teachers whose exam results were, let's say, a good average, but they were way beyond a good average in terms of their care for individual pupils. They were highly regarded and popular teachers. So I don't think it's obvious always what a good teacher looks like. Something about research. In the middle of this slide, you can see I put three examples of research that's done into the characteristics of good teachers and good schools, which is well worth looking at. In the United Kingdom, we use the Education Endowment Foundation, which you can easily look up. And the Education Endowment Foundation is constantly doing research. Every month, they're putting up new examples of the characteristics of good teachers and based on research across the country. And many of you, if you are a teacher, will have heard of John Hattie, who wrote a series of books, all really called Visible Learning. He's based in New Zealand, but he's done exactly the same thing. He's collated research across the world in the characteristics of good teachers. So that's worth looking at. And all of us, including China and Hong Kong, are interested in the PISA scores, which apply to individual cities and individual countries, not individual teachers, but nevertheless lead to the question, where are the best teachers? Who are the most effective teachers in the world? So those three are well worth looking at. Me, as a head teacher, when I'm assessing how good my staff are, I would do two or three things. I would always, every year, look at where each pupil got their best results and their worst results to see whether there were certain teachers who were consistently getting the best results for individual pupils, or indeed the worst, and that is a clue for me. Secondly, I would always use value-added scores. That is, scores which measure the progress that children make. Particularly for me, the progress that they make between the ages of 11 and 16, which is where one set of exams are sat, or the progress they make between 16 and 18, which is when A levels are sat. And those value-added scores tell you how well each pupil has done compared to all the other pupils in the sample who took exams or tests when they were 11 or 16. It shows the value added. It shows the progress that they've made compared to other children. That's very important, obviously, if you're trying to determine who are the most effective teachers. Sometimes I would do a student survey, which simply said, who do you think are your best teachers and why? That's something that some schools do. And I would occasionally do the same thing with parents. I would send my parents a questionnaire asking them what they think about the school, which gave them the opportunity to say something about the best or the worst teachers. So all of that is good information for me when trying to answer the question, who are the good teachers in my school? Okay, over to you, Tracy. Next slide.
Thank you, Barnaby. That was a great answer. So in the primary setting, as Barnaby said, there are differences, but there are also some similarities. And very much the things that Barnaby was mentioning also apply to primary. So the teachers that are able to secure good progress for their pupils tend to have a proven track record, if you like. We look for evidence that teachers have supported their pupils in reaching or exceeding the expectations for their age. We look for excellent behaviour management. We know that if the behaviour is not particularly good, then the children are not going to be learning well. We have a greater role as pastoral carers in primary. Those of you that work in primary will know that. We tend to be there for every little upset or piece of care that's needed for our pupils all of the time. So they're also very well organised and they work well with colleagues. And going back to what Barnaby said about John Hattie's most impactful intervention, if you like, for securing good teaching is when teachers work together. He calls that collective teacher efficacy. And that tends to secure the best progress for pupils, and that's him looking at results of research all around the world. So working well with colleagues is a really crucial thing. Planning thoughtful lessons to keep pupils engaged, to make sure that they make progress, motivating them, trying to get them really intrinsically motivated rather than motivated by external or extrinsic rewards such as stickers or house points. Having really good relationships with pupils, very strong relationships. When pupils like their primary school teacher, they're much more likely to want to do well and work hard for them. And where possible, having good relationships with parents so that the parents can let you know if there's anything that's going on with their child that it would be useful to know as a teacher. So back to you, Barnaby, if you could have a little, if you could tell us a little bit more about research. I'm just highlighting our book here. So Barnaby and I have recently published this book. It came out 6 months ago, I think September, and it's been very well received. And in it, we try between us to cover everything that primary and secondary teachers should know about how to teach well.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So now I'm going to talk about something very extraordinary that has happened in England, particularly, but not only, in secondary schools. So between 2010 and 2024, with a couple of small interruptions, we had just one person who was in charge of teaching standards in state schools in England, and his name was Nick Gibb. And he has helpfully written a book about what he did. And here it is. It's called Reforming Lessons. So anyone can buy that book if you want more information about what I'm now going to describe to you. So in this period in England, 14 years of work by the schools minister, Nick Gibb, we saw a very big improvement in our schools, which was reflected in the PISA league table position, which we're going to look at in a couple of slides' time. But Nick Gibb, he was somebody who did a lot of research into what are the most effective teaching methods. He, between 2005 and 2010, did research all over the world. He went to places like China, certainly, but also Singapore, Australia, the United States, and he interviewed the head teachers of some of the highest achieving schools in the United Kingdom. And he came to be of the opinion that in secondary schools, the four things which really seemed to matter were: one, a knowledge-rich curriculum. Now, what that means is a curriculum where the pupils are taught a lot. They're taught a lot of information, they're taught a lot of facts, and they're also taught skills. But his idea, which he has borrowed from E.D. Hirsch in the United States, is that you cannot think about skills unless you know a lot. How can you, for example, be a skillful historian or a skillful scientist unless you know a lot about that subject? So he revised the syllabuses that we offer for exams taken by 16 and 18-year-olds and made them harder, made them significantly harder, particularly in mathematics. So that's the first thing. We should all be teaching to a higher level than we are, is what he was saying, and he made that possible by toughening up the syllabuses in England. Secondly, he believed in teachers standing at the front of the class and directing what went on. That may sound absolutely obvious to some of you, but in schools in England, this wasn't always the case. He believed in teacher-led lessons, where the teacher determined what the pupils were doing. He said, well, within each lesson, every teacher should be checking for understanding. So it doesn't mean that the pupils were sitting there quietly. No, the teacher would be asking them questions all the time to see whether all the pupils understood what was going on. And then finally, he said, the final thing that really matters is what we sometimes call retrieval practice, but what I just mean as testing, regular testing. And I certainly think that in some subjects you're going to be testing every single lesson. That would be true in mathematics, it would be true in modern languages, but even in a subject like biology or history or geography, you will be testing them, I would say, every 2 weeks as a minimum, in order to help drive the information into their long-term memory, but also to see whether the pupils have actually understood and grasped what it is you are doing as a teacher. So these are the 4 things that he believes are the characteristics of the most successful schools in England. But also, he went to visit primary schools in this country and in Singapore, particularly, and came to the conclusion that reading should be taught by systematic synthetic phonics methods, and that maths should be taught using the mastery maths method, which we borrowed from Singapore. And every primary school teacher in England was trained to use those 2 methods with a high level of success. So we're going to come back to him in a minute, but now over to Tracy.
Thank you, Barnaby. So again, looking at primary, so I would very much agree with the things that Barnaby has said. So those first 6 things down there that Barnaby mentioned. And I would also add that in order to be able to teach effectively, teacher modelling has to be really, really strong. So whilst the teacher is modelling how the work should be done, they could be speaking aloud. We actually call it thinking aloud quite often. So a teacher might be modelling how to do a particular mathematic step in a certain equation, for example, and they will think aloud whilst they're doing it. And they will say, oh, I know that I need to move the 3 over to there because I've multiplied it by such and such. And so with that think aloud modelling, that can be really, really helpful for pupils to learn. Obviously, as I've said before, excellent behaviour for learning, assessment for learning. So cannot underestimate the importance of this. When I first started teaching, I taught a lesson. I would plan a lesson very, very carefully, and I would teach it from the plan. But what I didn't make sure was that pupils actually understood what I'd been teaching them by the end of it. So it's really, really important that we assess their learning as we go along. We make sure that we check up that they're actually understanding, gaining the new knowledge and skills that we are hoping that they will be gaining through the lesson. We need to make sure we have excellent relationships with our pupils. Otherwise, as I've mentioned before, they are unlikely to want to learn particularly well for a primary school teacher. And I'm handing back to Barnaby now to talk a little bit about PISA ranking in maths.
So here are the PISA scores that I referred to. And I want you to look at the line which is red in colour, which is the line for England. And you can see that back in 2009, England was 26th in the world, not bad out of about 60 schools, but not brilliant either. But since 2009, there's been a steady improvement, so that during the last PISA, which was 2022, we were 11th. And 11th is quite good because most of the countries that got better scores than England are very much smaller countries. They could be individual cities. They're places like Hong Kong and Singapore. And they're also places which are much less diverse than the United Kingdom, which is very diverse in terms of income, ethnicity, and so on. And it looks as if we're continuing that upward trajectory. But you can see that the other parts of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, have done much less well. I mean, Scotland has gone right down. Wales went up a bit and then went down a bit and so on. And the reason that he would say, Nick Gibb would say for that, is that they did not follow the reforms which he pioneered in England alone. So this is the evidence that he would give for the very significant improvement in maths, particularly, but it applies to other subjects as well, in England, just part of the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. And then something about the school in England that gets the best GCSE progress scores. So the progress scores are measured for when children are 16 and take these GCSE exams typically 8 different subjects, and we measure the progress that they've made from the tests that they all took across the whole country at the age of 11. So it's progress between the age of 11 and 16. Now, Michaela is a school in West London, in a relatively disadvantaged part of West London, close to Wembley Stadium, and they get the best progress every year compared to every other school. So it's worth asking ourselves, what is it that's distinctive about this school? It's very strict. That's the first thing. There's the pupils, for example, are not allowed to talk in the corridors. They have to behave in a very particular way when they're in lessons. And they make no bones about that. Secondly, all teachers are trained for about a week in the school before they start, trained in the methods that Michaela Community School believes in. And the methods that Michaela Community School believes in includes these knowledge-rich texts. And I've, in this slide, said high-level texts which they wrote. So they concluded that existing textbooks in England were not stretching the pupils enough. They wanted to get the average, let's say, 13 or 14-year-old pupil in their school up to the level of a typical 16-year-old by the time they were only 14. So they are teaching to a higher level from a younger age than other schools. That's really the secret of their success. But also they're doing what I was suggesting in my last slide, and that is they are testing them very regularly. So there's no opportunity for any pupil to fall behind. And if they do fall behind, then action is going to be taken to drag the weakest pupils up to the standard that's expected. And the standards that's expected in this school is very high. I mean, basically, every pupil is expected to get either the top grade in GCSE or the second to top grade. And on the whole, they achieve that. So the question I ask at the bottom of this slide, to what extent is this down to the individual teachers in Michaela School, or is it already attributable to the school system? And the answer is a bit of both, but I think in large measure, it's due to the school's system. You could put a teacher into this school who was only average, they would still get very good results because they are obliged to follow the Michaela Community School model.
Thank you,
Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting. And just a little think about accountability for primary schools as well. So I'll be very brief because it's not the same in China and Hong Kong. But in England, we are accountable. Primary schools are accountable to Ofsted that come and inspect primary schools. We have league tables where our results from the end of Key Stage 2, year sixes, are literally placed in an order of a league table from top to bottom. We have high level accountability to our chief executive officers, to our local authorities. We have the test results, and we also look at attendance percentages. And as Barnaby said, this is the same question. Is it the teachers doing well here, or is it the school's system? But Barnaby, what I really want to know, and I'm going to ask you for the next slide, is how did you become a good teacher yourself?
Well, let's assume that I was a good teacher. I don't know whether I was or not.
I think you were.
But if I was a good teacher, I would say there were 5 things which made me a good teacher. And top of my list, because I'm a secondary school teacher, was that I knew a lot about my subject. I really liked my subject. I carried on learning it all through my life. I would every year spend a bit of time improving my subject knowledge because I think that made my lessons more effective and more interesting, essentially. And it certainly meant that I could teach to a high level because I knew a lot. Secondly, I would always reflect on my own teachers at school. All of us had teachers at our school, some of which we thought were really good. And so the example of my own teachers at school was always in my mind. I think there's something about my personality which meant that I was able, even as a young teacher, as a 21-year-old, I was able to command the classroom because I was quite strict. But on the other hand, I would rapidly demonstrate to my pupils that I was also someone who was fairly warm and was on their side. So there's something about your personality, which I think I probably got from my father. My father was a priest in the church, and so he was someone who was used to public speaking. So I learned public speaking from him. And finally, I would say I spent the first 12 years of my teaching career at Eton, which is a good school. And I learnt a lot from my colleagues, just observing what these days we would call experts, but observing teachers who were effective, and in that way, gradually improving. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Barnaby. So for me, the number one is always watching other excellent teachers. Well, that was before I was a good teacher myself. I would find the time whenever I could to observe somebody that I knew was a really, really good teacher in the school. Our students, as part of our courses at Buckingham, are it's part of their course to actually observe another teacher at least once a week. And I cannot possibly overstate the importance of doing that. It is so beneficial because you can pick out all of the great things that they do, all of the things that perhaps are not so great, and then it helps to inform your own practice because we are reflective practitioners all the time, aren't we? Being aware of research, as we've mentioned before, is important because you know, science to do with the brain, neuroscience is moving on and shifting all of the time. Being in the right school setting with the right age group. Some teachers are not happy in certain schools and benefit from moving to other schools. I had an influential teacher when I was in year 6, that's primary, 11-year-old, and because I found him very influential, I think that's why I wanted to become a teacher of the same year group, although I did teach all the way through. And self-reflection, being a reflective practitioner, when you're walking home or cycling home or driving home at the end of the day, it naturally runs through our minds, doesn't it, about thinking about how well the lessons have gone or not, and what might I do again the next time. So it's that natural self-reflection that I really think helps to make us into good teachers. So Barnaby, we need high expectations, don't we?
Okay, everybody. So now we come to the heart of this webinar, because we're now going to tell you what we think the characteristics of good teachers actually are. And we've got 7 or 8 of them. So here we go. So the first characteristic of all good teachers that we have ever known is that they have high expectations of all their pupils. So in a secondary school, let me just give you an example of what that means. So I'm giving my pupils a test every 2 weeks. And obviously I will expect them all to do well. That's what high expectations means. So what that means is I'm going to set a pass mark. And my pass mark is going to be, let's imagine it's 14 or 15 out of 20. So I've told them this is the pass mark. They sit the test. I mark the test. And now I'd see who's got less than, let's say, 14 out of 20. Okay, I've made a note of that in my mark book, but that's not really the point. The point about a teacher with high expectations is that they're then going to do something else. They're going to, for example, ask those children who got less than 14 out of 20 to do a retest. So I've got to find time when they can come and do another version of this test with me. And that I'm going to keep going until they all pass. That's what high expectations really means. It means going further probably than most teachers are able to do. It takes time, it takes effort. And the other thing I'm doing at the same time is developing motivation, because it's very difficult to persuade teenage boys, for example, to spend their life revising the work I've given them if they're not sufficiently motivated. And so I'm going to motivate them by, for example, praising them from time to time about something. Even if they're not particularly strong academically, I can find something to praise them for so that they feel that I'm on their side and that I'm going to help them. And I'm also going to encourage them to believe that the exam that they're taking with me when they're 16 or 18 is important and worthwhile to them. And I also need to persuade them that if they do some work for me, they will get better results. And I can demonstrate that by making them do work and then giving them good results. So all of those things are part of high expectations. Over to you.
Thank you, Barnaby. I would completely agree with that. John Hattie's research again talks about the importance of high expectations. And there was a very interesting study done in America in 1968 by Rosenthal and Jacobson called the Pygmalion effect, spelt Pygmalion. Very interesting to read. It's about how the teachers that had the higher expectations of the students, their pupils performed in excess of what would have been expected compared with the pupils whose teachers did not have high expectations. So it really, really matters, and that we can communicate those high expectations to them and tell them what we expect from them, and why we expect that they can do it for us. And I just wanted to recommend two books here. So the one at the top is about having high expectations for behaviour. When the Adults Change, Everything Changes by Paul Dix. We use it a lot at Buckingham. Our first essay is all about behaviour management, according to Paul Dix's way of doing things. And the second one is Teaching Backwards. And that really deals with what I was saying a few slides ago about how, you need to think, what is it that I need my students, my pupils to learn by the end of this lesson that they don't know yet? So, and then you go backwards from that step. So this is what the learning outcome is going to be. Therefore, that's how I need to plan the lesson to make sure that they all leave the lesson with that new knowledge or that new skill.
So number 2 is good subject knowledge, which I've already mentioned. Where will I get my good subject knowledge from? I might get it from recently published books, magazines. I'm going to be a member of my subject association. So in England, I'm a member of the Royal Geographical Society and the Geographical Association, for example, and I go to their lectures every month. I keep an eye on my exam board website where I'm looking at past papers and the examiners' reports. And all the time, I'm trying to develop more and more subject knowledge because I know that's going to make me a better teacher in a secondary school. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Barnaby. And one of the things that primary school teachers sometimes think is, do I have to know everything? Do I have to have excellent subject knowledge in everything? And the range across the national curriculum in England and in international schools is vast. So it may be that in some schools you're asked to teach 11 subjects or 12 or 13 subjects. And you don't have to be an expert in each of those subjects, but you have to know the content up until the age of your pupils. So if you're teaching pupils that are 11, then you need to know whatever it is that you need to cover in order for them to learn that content, and actually go a little bit beyond that for those pupils that need that little bit of stretch and challenge. So when I first started teaching pupils at the upper range of primary, in year 5 and year 6, I would make sure that I went back to my GCSE maths, and I would make sure that I could go beyond them. So it is a fair undertaking, but it is something that's worthwhile doing.
So the third thing that really matters with a good teacher is, can they manage the behaviour in the class? Because without good behaviour, not much can be achieved. But the good news is that on the whole, the majority of pupils prefer teachers who can maintain order. And if you're a teacher who cannot maintain order, you will get complaints and criticisms by some parents and some pupils. But you're also going to make your lessons fun and interesting. That's also part of behaviour management, because if you make your lessons fun and interesting, the pupils are more likely to be with you and be willing to behave. But behaviour management, the thing which worries new teachers most, is very, very important in all types of schools. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Barnaby. And very similar, as I've mentioned before, it's more pastoral. In the primary school, it's more relationship based. So you do tend to have quite close relationships with your pupils. Apart from one or two subjects, you're likely to be teaching them most of the week. We need to know about our pupils, know how they are, ask them about themselves, their hobbies, really get to know them. It tends to be a slightly gentler approach in primary schools. And if behaviour goes wrong, it's like more likely to be a restorative conversation about what went wrong, what happened, why do you think it happened, um, who might have been upset, and what might we be able to do to sort it. So those kinds of things are what I mean when I say restorative conversations around behaviour. Back to you, Barnaby.
So the
Testing.
fourth thing that really matters is regular testing. And the reason I keep talking about that is because I've noticed that in some schools with some teachers, the teacher is teaching perfectly well, but nothing much is being learnt because no one is requiring the pupils to put a bit of effort into memorization. And that's what needs to happen because only if the pupil puts a lot of effort into memorization does the things that the teacher is teaching get driven into their long-term memory. Once it's in the long-term memory, then we can be confident that, well, up to a point, that they'll be able to retrieve it when it comes to a test or an exam, and it may well even be there for the rest of their life. And that is the purpose of education. The purpose of education is not, let's teach these people. The purpose of education is we want to teach something to children that they remember for many, many years. Over
Thank
to
you,
you.
Barnaby. Thank you. And all I really wanted to say was that I've mentioned it already. We assess the learning, we assess how the learning has gone, but we also need to assess it as we go along as well. So we call it assessment of learning and assessment for learning. What happens when things go wrong, Barnaby, and pupils start falling behind?
So the fifth thing is this, that if you're teaching a class of 20 or 30 or 40, you're going to have some pupils who fall behind. That's inevitable. And so if you're going to do what I've already suggested you need to do, you've got to have time somewhere in your school timetable to help them catch up. It might be you teaching them, it might be a teaching assistant, but you've got to find time. It's especially important, I would say, for primary age children, those aged, let's say, 7 to 11, because we cannot allow them to leave school unless they can read up to a decent standard. But it's probably true with numeracy, and it's true with every exam that pupils take. So your school has to have systems, and you, the teacher, have to be willing and able to use those systems. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Barnaby. And I know Barnaby will talk about revision, but just very briefly, Barnaby touched on retrieval practice there. Every single time I go into a lesson now, it starts with retrieval practice. So it's that cognitive science understanding that actually we keep things in our memory and we need to bring them out of our memory so that we can build upon them for our new learning. So each lesson now will start with one of these ideas here on this placemat. It might be remembering 3 facts that they learnt the last lesson in that subject. It might be explaining a key concept from last week. So it's like a really short-term form of revision. Barnaby.
And I would say in a secondary school, it's very important that the pupils, if they're going to revise for tests and exams, have something good to revise from. And I personally prefer the idea of written notes. I think it's much harder to learn from a screen, even though it's the case that in England, it's often the case that teachers put work up on a computer program on a screen, but having notes that you have written is the best method. Next slide.
Okay, working with parents. I'll go first, Barnaby, here.
Yeah.
So, and I think I mentioned this before, so I'm not going to take too long, but parents are the primary carers. Parents, sorry, are the primary carers, and they may know something about their child that it's important for you to know. So sometimes when you're able to have meetings with parents, it's often useful to make notes so that they know that what they're saying is important to you. that you're listening to them. And you can also pass back things to the parents about how well their child is doing, about whether they need certain practice with reading more often or practicing their multiplication times tables or something. So it's really important that we work well with our parents as well. Barnaby.
Yeah, and in a primary school, you want your parents to be doing reading with their child for a little while every evening. And for me in a secondary school, I want to persuade the parents that in the holidays before an important exam, they insist that their children sit down and revise rather than just going on holiday or switching off. So parents have an important role to play. Next slide. So
So,
now,
go on, Barnaby.
just a few things that I think are best avoided by teachers. The three things, first of all, which I call progressive methods. They're not bad in themselves, but they're not as effective as the alternatives. So pupils being left to discover information themselves, or working in groups, or doing projects. None of those three things are bad in themselves, but they're less effective than direct instruction, standing at the front, children being taught as a group, but being required to respond individually. If you want to ask me questions about that towards the end, then by all means do so. I think also the use of computers is something which we may want to talk about in the questions at the end. But in England so far, the use of computers has, if anything, made standards worse because it's really hard to learn from a screen. And finally, in England, there's been a big debate about whether or not children should be taught skills like, for example, teamwork or critical thinking. And the experience that we've had is that those things are important and worthwhile, but they're not as important as the basic subject knowledge which lies behind those skills like critical thinking. You cannot think critically about the subject biology unless you know quite a lot of biology. So those are things in my list I would avoid.
Thank you, Barnaby, and I would agree with you. So things that we all do, we all use, we use motivational techniques to inspire our pupils. We use worked examples and modelling. We try to avoid cognitive overload and make sure that we build up the learning in little chunked steps, and dual coding, making sure that we've got something written and something perhaps drawn, or it might be, as we're doing now, having something to look at and speaking as well. So it's passing the information in two ways. And just before I close the slides so that we can all see each other upon the screen, there's two QR codes for you. So if you'd like to follow WeChat, it's the first QR code, and LinkedIn is the second code. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Barnaby and Tracy, for that really engaging talk. I think there's lots there that our participants will want to delve into. I know a lot of teachers are struggling with how to deal with the pastoral side of schools as that becomes more and more important, how to deal with technology in classrooms. And I think some of the points you made about what things to avoid, Barnaby, maybe something, as you said, we can delve more into. We have had, so to all participants, please do type your questions in the chat box, anything that comes to mind. We've had one question already, so I will ask that now. So the question was around, and thank you very much for this question. The question was around high expectations. So we hear teachers urging their students to do their best and saying that students learn at their own pace. How do the speakers feel about this, and how does this work if all the children are expected to pass the same test at the same time?
Well, for me, I think that although we need to some extent, match the learning to the pupil's ability, we need to make sure that they get to the same place. There needs to be a ceiling at which everybody gets to. So for me, we teach to the top. We teach to the top, and then any pupil who's not quite there, we scaffold for. We put things in place to help them so they can get to that point as well. Of course, people can smash through the ceiling if they're particularly able at learning. But in England, we don't really anymore go down the road of letting pupils learn at their own pace. If somebody's finding it difficult to keep up, then we will give them some sort of intervention, as Barnaby mentioned earlier, which might be extra practice with a teacher in reading or maths or whatever it might be. So we teach to the top and we scaffold, we put in things for pupils that are finding it more difficult.
So I agree with that. If you allow children to learn at their own pace, what happens if they're very slow? The answer is that you have to tell them to pick up the pace, and if necessary, you have to give them a bit of extra teaching so they keep up with everybody else. So this is a yes and no. This is a yes and no question. I certainly don't believe in allowing pupils to to learn at their own pace, because the slow ones will then fall behind inevitably. And the very good results of a school like Michaela's school I spoke about earlier shows that all the children, the very clever ones, the ones who are rather slow, they all get up to a high level by the age of 16. So it shows it can be done.
Thank you very much.
Could I just step in, Megan? I've got to leave in a couple of minutes, as you know, and there is a question about an early years educator. Might be best.
Perfect. Yes, please do.
Okay.
Are
So
you, do you want me
yeah,
to read the question out so that everybody knows?
I'll read it. It's okay. So
Yeah.
it's a very good question, Gloria. Gloria asks, where does an early years educator fall in these categories of being effective? I think really primary school teachers in England can move around the year groups quite frequently, and they often do because it's good practice. So somebody who's just taught 8-year-olds might the following year be asked to taught in the early years, and the practice is different. It's definitely different. You're absolutely right to point that out. But it's still the same kind of qualities of what makes a good teacher practitioner in that early years setting. It's having really good relationships with pupils. It's maintaining good relationships with parents. Some subject knowledge doesn't need to be quite so good, but knowledge of the way that we teach in early years needs to be. So the way that pupils are questioned, the way that you scaffold verbal reasoning for pupils, you suggest things that they might want to find out. You have to be very, very good at teaching knowledge and teaching basic maths. So that's in place even for the very, very early years teachers. So the principles are the same, but we would give a teacher a little bit more input in how to go about scaffolding learning, in how to go about helping to develop pupils' speaking and listening skills, how to help to develop their vocabulary, and how to suggest ways that they might like to go about learning. So, for example, if they're playing in the water tray, we might go over to them and ask them a question and say, I wonder how much more water you might need to fit into that glass to make it full, whatever it might be. So we're giving them ideas constantly, all of the time. I hope that's helped to answer your question. It's been really lovely spending the morning with you all. Barnaby's staying, so please make sure everybody stays with him, and I will see you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Cheerio, Tracy.
Thank you so
I'm
much,
just going to quickly
Tracy.
answer Kenneth Wong's question, which is about doing a PGCE at a prep school. Can you still teach at a senior school for A levels one day? Yes, the answer is yes, you can. I would say that it's best, if you're doing your teaching at a prep school, to focus a bit on older pupils, and whether or not a senior school, a school for older children, will accept you is rather up to them. But I train hundreds of students who teach the prep school and then go on to teach the senior school, a secondary school. That's perfectly normal. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you very much, Barnaby. Yeah, I was going to ask if you had a insight on that one. Perfect.
Yeah.
But for those who do have any questions on admissions, we may be able to answer them here or on how it works. I've posted the email addresses you can also reach our admissions team on as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have another question. What advice would you give to teachers teaching big size classrooms as they struggle with classroom management while trying to deliver their subject knowledge?
Okay, so that's a really fundamental and important question, because you cannot teach your subject knowledge if the class is not fully under your control. And I know that in China, sometimes the classes are very big. I mean, when I was the headmaster of Harrow, I used to take pupils at the age of 16 who came from Hong Kong, for example, where they'd often been in classes of 40. So I'm completely used to this idea. So the answer is you have to have good control over your classroom, and you have to make your lessons dynamic and interesting with the pupils involved as much as they possibly can be throughout the lesson. Now, to some extent, I would say it's down to the school itself to help you with this struggle. All schools and all teachers in all schools will be asking this question. And if it was me, if I was doing teacher training, I would want to go and observe those teachers who are known to have very good classroom control with large classes. What is it that they do? But the answer is, in a nutshell, they look at themselves as adults, and the children are seen as children, and the adults are going to take control, whatever happens. You are going to be in control. You're not going to allow the pupils to take control. You are therefore going to stop anything in the classroom you don't like, and you will have a range of weapons at your disposal, which will be described to you by your school. What are the methods by which a pupil is controlled or punished or whatever it might be? And if you're a beginning teacher, you'll certainly have a mentor who will be looking after you, and that person will also need to be involved. Sometimes some of my students find that they cannot manage to keep control, in which case they then bring their mentor into the classroom and they work together to maintain control. But it is a very necessary first step. So my advice would be learn from other teachers, learn from the methods that all schools and all successful teachers use, and do that before you try to deliver subject knowledge, which you cannot do if the class is not under control. Okay, next question.
Thank you very much. Next question is, what is your view on project-based learning and teaching senior students research? The question goes on. I'll read the whole one and then we might be able to split it up. Or what about teaching them beyond the scope of A-level or IB curriculum by doing things like the liberal arts?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not I'm in favour of project-based learning to some extent, but I just don't think it should dominate the entire syllabus or curriculum. Project-based learning is a very good thing because it encourages independence of thought, initiative, and it's just a good experience for life that you're working on a project on your own with only some guidance from the teacher. Your question, Kenneth, says, and teaching senior school students research. Absolutely, that's the whole point, isn't it? So let me give you an example. So I taught A-level geography. All my pupils were required to do a fieldwork dissertation. They had to collect the data in the summer holidays. They then had to convert the data into graphs and maps, and they had to analyze the data. It was a proper research project, which had, I would say, a high degree of value. The problem with project-based learning as a means of teaching someone is that it's or assessing someone is that it's easily corrupted by teachers giving a lot of help, parents giving a lot of help, copying from other people. So I believe in project-based learning, but also I believe in terminal exams, normal invigilated exams. So your second question, teaching beyond the scope of the A-level or IB curriculum, I certainly believe in that. I believe in it strongly for several reasons. I mean, first of all, going to school is not just about passing exams. It ought to be about something more than that. And in a good school, you will find teachers who are keen to teach something which is not going to be examined. It could be liberal arts, but it could be a range of different subjects. Personally, I always taught two things which were not examined. One was law and the English legal system, which I thought could be interesting for those of my pupils who wanted to become lawyers. And I taught history of art, not as an examined subject, but as something that I thought that all young people ought to know about. So I'm very much in favour of teaching beyond the scope of A-level, as long as your pupils can manage it within the context of their curriculum, which if they're doing A-level or IB, they probably can. Slightly easier with A-level than IB, actually. Okay, next question.
Thank you, Barnaby. Okay, we've got a great question here from Nancy, who was at our annual China reception in November. So welcome, Nancy, and thanks for your question. Her question is, how do you balance behavior management and good relationships with the students? She continues, I feel that when I'm harsh on my students with strict rules, the students fight against the rules very hard, especially when other teachers are not that strict and consistent with the same rules, and it destroys our relationship. But if I lower my expectation and make my rules softer, they can't achieve much academically.
Yeah, brilliant question. So the answer, my answer to this is very, very clear. That your job is to ensure that your pupils achieve a lot academically. If they can't achieve a lot academically because they behave badly if you relax the rules, I would say to you, do not relax the rules. The problem is that other teachers in your school are not that strict and consistent. That's a matter for you to chat to the senior management team in your school about, because actually there's a lot to be said for all teachers being consistent and applying the same rules to the same degree. But I would encourage you to stick with what you're doing. Don't worry too much if the students fight against it. That's their problem. You're the adult, they're the children. You know what your job is. Your job is to teach them a lot academically. That takes priority. Next question.
So, George, you have raised your hand, which is wonderful. We are asking people to type their message in the chat if that's possible. Or I will hand over to Scarlett to see if she can unmute you to ask a question. Is that possible, Scarlett?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Hello.
Thanks, George.
Good
Hi.
day. So, yeah, and thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm much concerned about this question that was raised concerning the behavioral attitude of students in the class. Prof was talking about being consistent with your actions in the class as a teacher. Now, I have found myself in such a situation almost 2 years now, and here in China. Student tends to complain, and what they do is that they will have to now report you to management when it comes to um, when it comes to feedback, right? So, like say every semester there will be a feedback that you have to students have to report to management, to their mothers or parents or whatsoever. Now, other teachers are not doing it, whereby they are not strict. So you standing on your toe each and every semester or every calendar year, there is a continuous complaints about you. And the complaints is not even leaning towards your strictness, but it's leaning towards you being not a good teacher. And that is a way of sabotaging. And Most schools will say, hey, we are into business, we need to keep our students in balance, our image and everything. So it's in a place of dilemma. And so whatever my friend just raised, it's happening. And so if there is a very critical outlook and and solving problems of that nature that can be dealt with, I will be very, very grateful for that. Thank you.
Okay, well, again, a great question, George. Thank you very much. So, I think first of all, you should not be in any way ashamed of trying to maintain high levels of behaviour and consistency within your lessons. That's what most, maybe not all, but that's what many pupils want. They don't want to sit in lessons which are disturbed by bad behaviour, in my experience. Secondly, if you're being sabotaged by student feedback, that is something that you need to discuss with the senior management team. In other words, they have a role to play here. If students are using the student feedback to, in some way, criticize you, then you need to talk that through with the authors of the student feedback and discuss how that affects you. I think also that that in the end, most teachers are judged by their results. I think that obviously, in my experience, the best teachers are pretty strict, but eventually, by making their lessons fun and interesting, and taking an interest in individual pupils and their welfare, they come to have a good relationship with their pupils. But I can only repeat that in the end, most teachers are going to be judged by their results. And you can be a very popular teacher, but if you get bad results, parents will be very unhappy. I'd just like to mention, I mean, many of you on this call will know the books of Doug Lemov, Lemov. So Doug Lemov has set up and runs a lot of schools in the United States, and they follow a system which he's established, which is around strict rules, actually, strict rules. Everyone in the class has to behave in a certain way. And those schools are very successful. Michaela School in this country is based partly on the Doug Lemov methods of teaching. And those children are happy and they perform very well. The behavior is tightly controlled. If you're in a school where the behavior is not tightly controlled and there's nothing you can do about it, I would suggest you move to another school. That would be my advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Barnaby. Great answer. So we have another question for you. When do SEN professional service come? When do SEN professional services comes in teaching and learning processes, in your opinion?
Yeah. So I'm a great believer in giving special needs assistance to those children who need it. In England at the moment, we have far too many children being diagnosed as having special needs, about 25% actually, and it's pretty hard for the teachers to cope with that, and most of them don't really know how to manage it. But nevertheless, in theory, the special needs assistants in this country, in England, they're called SENCOs, are valuable. They go and give extra help to those pupils who need it. They keep an eye on those who are definitely struggling, and they do so right from the beginning. But in my opinion, in the best schools in England, the key element is that the teacher has high expectations of all the pupils, even those with a special needs diagnosis. So that the special needs pupils, on the one hand, they can have some extra help from the SENCO, but on the other hand, they are all expected to keep up and get to a good level. Now, it won't always be the case because someone who has severe learning difficulties will not be able to get to a high level, but the teacher will act as if they can all get there. And the important thing is not to lower your expectations just because someone has got a special educational needs label. That would be my advice. So Senkos do a good job. Don't rely on them to sort everything out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Barnaby. If anybody else has any more questions, please do type in the chat. I had one question for you, Barnaby, that I did want to ask. You presented a lot of research in this in your presentation, and how do you incorporate that research into the teacher training that you run at the University of Buckingham?
Well, we incorporate it fully, and we do it by sending all our trainee teachers a piece of research to read every week. We keep it relatively straightforward and short, but every single week, every single one of my trainees is required to read a bit of research and then discuss it with their mentor in their school, and where it's possible, to demonstrate that they've understood the research through their teaching. So every week for 20 weeks, this is what happens. And the other thing is that they are expected to know the research. So if they say, I believe in teaching in a certain way, I would want to say to them, okay, you tell me why you believe in that. Can you quote the research which backs your views? Because sometimes teachers have adopted methods which they believe are right, but they've got no good evidence for it, or they've copied it from someone else. But it's very, very important that they should know the research background. And that is why I recommended the Education Endowment Foundation, which anybody in the world can access, and it shows the results of that kind of research. It's fundamental to our teacher training.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Barnaby. I think we've come to the end of our questions and the end of our session. Many thank you to all of you for joining our webinar this evening, and a huge thank you to Professor Barnaby Lenon and Tracy Smith in her absence for delivering such an interesting talk. If any of you would like to learn more about the courses that are run by the University of Buckingham, then please do get in touch with us. I will post the email addresses again in the chat now. And we will be emailing out to all participants of the webinar the recording of this webinar and more information about the courses that we run and how to work with us. So we look forward to doing so in the future. Thank you very much, everybody.
Cheerio, everybody. Bye-bye.